Hello and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. You can also find a full archive of previous Trendlines episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. On today's episode, we'll be going to Thailand, which for nearly 5 months has been in the throes of a historic pro-democracy uprising. Protesters have braved water cannons and arbitrary arrests to challenge the current government, led by Prime Minister Prayuth Chan-ocha, the leader of a 2014 coup and later the head of the military junta that ruled Thailand until last year. Breaking a traditional taboo, demonstrators are also demanding reforms of Thailand's monarchy, which is protected by one of the world's harshest lèse-majesté laws. The King of Thailand addressed the protests for the first time in rare public comments over the weekend, suggesting he may be open to compromise with the demonstrators. Meanwhile, as with all political unrest in Thailand, there is the ever-present possibility that the military will step in. I'm very honored to be able to discuss all of this today with one of the world's most renowned experts on Thailand, Tyrell Haberkorn. She's a professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a 2020 Guggenheim Fellow. Tyrell, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you so much for having me, Elliot.
To begin, the proximate cause of the current protests can be traced back to the brazen abduction of a pro-democracy activist who was living in exile in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, in June. Protests have been ongoing since then, but you wrote in a recent piece for Dissent that the confrontation really entered a critical phase on October 13th, and that was when the people, the state, and the monarchy entered into what you call a quote, battle unprecedented in Thai history. Why is that date so significant?
The date of October 13th is so significant because it was the first time where citizens, and in this case, a group of pro-democracy protesters, engaged in symbolic protest of a passing royal motorcade. Previously, the only kind of citizen reaction or engagement with a royal motorcade was to simply stand or sit by the side of the road as the motorcade passed by. In fact, one of the fascinating pieces of these current protests is long before they exploded out into the streets this year, beginning in 2019, there started to be critiques of royal motorcades on Twitter because in many instances, roads on which royal motorcades were passing were completely shut down. There would be no other cars and no other people on the roads at that time. So this time on October 13th, the symbolic action of protesters holding up the three-finger salute that has been used by Thai democracy protesters since 2014 was quite unprecedented. And then it catalyzed what has now been we're almost at 3 weeks of sustained protests by the people against the state.
What is it exactly about this uprising, other than what you just mentioned, the critiques of the monarchy, that makes it so unprecedented in Thailand's history, would you say?
There are several factors. Of course, as you know, one is the critique of the monarchy, and not even just critique, but there is a very well-outlined platform of reform that the protesters are offering, and one that is meant to bring the king under the Constitution rather than where he floats now, above the Constitution and above, underneath, inside politics in ways that are very hard to get a grasp on, and certainly impossible to bring under civilian and citizen control. So that's the first key aspect of these protests. The second is that the group of people in the streets now are a much wider group in terms of class, region, gender and sexuality, age, and their vision for the future than any of those who have been in the streets for the last 15 years, which, although there was constant public protest beginning in 2005, which now feels like an eternity ago in both years and Thai politics, the people who went into the streets were always focused on a quite narrow set of demands that was often just responding to their desire to oust one particular prime minister or another. Whereas this time, this group of people who involve every age, every region, and I would say every kind of democrat, broadly conceived, are asking for a new kind of relation between the rulers and the ruled. And in a sense, I think also a new kind of Thai society in which there is space for a wide range of actors.
What do you make of these rare public comments the king made over the weekend? He's back in Thailand now, not in Germany, where he likes to spend a lot of his time, but saying Thailand is, quote, the land of compromise, and reassuring people that he loves all Thais, regardless of the protests. What did you make of that?
I found the king's public appearance perplexing at best and difficult to interpret. At this present moment, it is difficult to understand precisely what the king means by compromise. The reason is that during the last 2.5 weeks, there have been over 90 people who have been arrested for peaceful protest and dissent. The group within this 90 who has been targeted most directly and intensely have been a number of key student leaders. And over the weekend, right around the same time that the king was going out to greet the people, these three of these key student leaders, Rung Panusea Satijira Watanagun, Penguin Parit Chiwirak, and Mike Banupong Jatnog, were all recovering in Rama the Ninth Hospital after they were released from prison late on Friday evening. They were then immediately rearrested on another set of charges, because all three of them are facing numerous sets of criminal charges in relation to protests from July onwards. And while the three were recovering in the hospital, in the case of both Penguin Parit and Mike Banupong, they were actually apprehended while they were still inside the prison. They were in the process of being released, and the prison allowed plainclothes police officers from an unknown unit into the prison to apprehend them. And force was used while that arrest was taking place. So in their case, they were in the hospital recovering from injuries sustained during that rearrest inside the prison. In the case of Rung Panusea, the doctors reported that she was suffering from severe dehydration and fatigue. While these three students were laying in hospital beds recovering, yet another group of policemen came into the hospital to read a new set of charges to each of them, to fingerprint them while they were in the hospital. Luckily, they have been allowed to stay in the hospital. It's unclear if they will be taken into custody again upon release. But it is difficult for me to understand how the king views compromise when such actions are still taking place. The other thing that is worth noting about the king's public appearance is that since this king came into power in October of 2016, he has not engaged in these kinds of informal conversations, informal meetings with the people until the last few weeks. And it seems as though this is a sign that the king and perhaps his advisors realize that they are facing an unprecedented challenge, and perhaps taking up some of the strategies that served his father, King Rama IX, so well would be useful in this moment.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, about the contrast between the current king and his predecessor, Rama IX, and how that's played into the current protests against the monarchy.
Absolutely. So King Rama IX, who is also known as King Bhumibol Adulyadej, became king at a very young age after the untimely death of his brother Rama VIII. So he became king in his early 20s following his brother's death in 1946. He then was on the throne until October 13th, 2016, when he died. At the time of his death, he was the world's longest reigning monarch. Rama IX ruled over a period of time which saw the reinvention of the Thai monarchy and the creation of a very particular place within Thai society and public life for the monarchy. This began in the late 1950s during the government of Field Marshal Surit Thanarat, who he first came into power in 1957. He then launched a coup against himself in 1958 to consolidate his power. And that period coincides with with really the very serious heating up of the Cold War in Southeast Asia. Surit and others in his government were very close to the US government and were very much a part of creating the alliance between the Thai military, the Thai state, and the US government to make Thailand into the launching pad for the US military's actions in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Part of this was a great deal of support to fight counterinsurgency in Thailand. As you can probably imagine, of course, the Thai military was very concerned with the rising tide of socialism and communism in the region, and the monarchy was extremely concerned. And in that period of time, an alliance emerges between the military and the monarchy that proved to be very valuable for both actors, in which they mutually supported one another and mutually created one another's images. So the military, the Thai army, for many, many years, in fact, until the last 10 years, on the side of every military base, there would be a sign reading Royal Thai Army for monarchy, nation, and religion. About 10 years ago, a fourth category was added, and people. So this gives you an idea of how central the monarchy was to the army. Similarly, the monarchy used the army to protect it. During this period of time, King Bhumibol Rama IX engaged in a number of very, very public visits to rural areas around the country that were seen as either being controlled by the Communist Party of Thailand. I should note that Thailand had a long-running Communist Party from the late 1920s up through the early 1980s. They, of course, never succeeded in pushing forward a communist transition, but they engaged in armed insurgency and then also in all sorts of organizing during that period as well. So with the aid of the military, with the aid of U.S. counterinsurgency advisors, the king became a very important both material and symbolic force against communism, beginning in the late 50s, early 1960s. This continues even after the end of the Cold War, and somehow, and I say somehow because it is unusual, I think, for an institution that controls such vast wealth, the monarchy and King Rama IX were able to cast himself as a monarch of the people. And not only to cast himself as a monarch of the people, but to occupy the hearts of many people in a very sincere way. And so while he was still alive, and even up until the present, many Thai homes had a photograph of the king, and one photograph of the king and often a photograph of the queen. Any business would have their photographs. Any public office would have their photographs.
I was going to say, any tourist who's been to Thailand probably has seen a photo of the king, and even from overseas, for casual observers, he did seem very charming. He's, playing saxophone with Benny Goodman, and exchanging photos of jazz musicians with Bill Clinton.
Absolutely. The love and respect that he commanded was sincere and expansive. This is not the case for his son. Rama X has had, since the very beginning of his reign, a great deal of rumor, gossip, and concern surrounding him, including his previous marriages and the fate of the women to whom he has been married, to questions of what he spends his time doing, while his father cultivated an image of someone who is engaged in connecting with his people, in working towards scientific advancement, in photographing the nation. Rama X instead is known for his love of riding his bicycle, particularly in Germany and Switzerland, and often for his sartorial choices.
What do you mean by sartorial choices?
By sartorial choices, I mean he has been frequently photographed wearing very tight-fitting pants and crop tops, sometimes sometimes either with his wife dressed similarly or his royal consort dressed similarly.
I would imagine the European tabloids have a lot of fun with that.
Yes, I believe the German tabloids have made quite an industry out of candid photographs of Rama X.
So moving away from the monarchy for a minute, it wasn't until last year that Thailand held elections after a 5-year period of military rule, which I mentioned in my introduction. But even then, the elections were heavily slanted in favor of the parties aligned with the military. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the mark that 5-year junta left on Thai citizens and how that contributed to the uprising we're seeing now.
Absolutely. It is worth noting from the start that the coup by the National Council for Peace and Order, or NCPO, that was carried out on the 22nd of May 2014, which was the 13th coup since the end of the absolute monarchy in 1932, was by far the most repressive regime to come into power since the Cold War regimes of Field Marshal Suret Thanarat, who I mentioned, and then 2 dictators who followed him. While there had been a coup in 2006, there was a very swift return to civilian rule after that. This time, the NCPO put into place a regime that used every means at its disposal to stifle political expression and just expression of opinion, period. And the way in which the 2019 election was framed was a continuation of this. The election took place under a new constitution, Thailand's 20th, which was passed in 2017, that included a series of additional laws governing how the election would take place, that included a very complicated system in which the military and military-aligned parties were strongly favored. Part of this is that there are 750 seats total in parliament. 250 of those seats are in an upper house or senate. All 250 of those seats were selected by the junta. Of those 500 lower house seats, the set of rules delimited in the laws pertaining to elections passed after the 2007 Constitution made it very, very difficult for parties that had strong regional bases, so including the Pheu Thai Party, which is the political party affiliated with the former Red Shirt movement and the former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra. The law was written in such a way that it was difficult for them to hold on to their regional support. In addition, when the March 2019 election took place, I think the NCPO and General Prayuth thought, okay, we have set up the legal framework and the vote tabulation framework so that we're going to come out on top. The thing is, the opposition that had been brewing during those 5 years of constriction of political freedom was so strong that despite the difficulties, not only did the Pheu Thai Party do very well, but also, most unexpectedly, the Future Forward Party did as well. Future Forward is important to pay attention to in this current moment as well, because the party was founded by Professor Piabut Sengkhanokgun, who was a law lecturer at Thammasat University, and Thanathorn Jungrungrungkit, who was both a progressive activist in his student days, and then at the time he was helping to run his family's business, a very large conglomerate called Thai Summit, which began in auto parts manufacturing and now has a very diversified portfolio. Future Forward is unusual for a number of reasons. First of all, it was founded by people who had not been involved in politics before. They weren't career politicians. Both Piabut and Thanathorn are in their early 40s and came from the worlds of student activism and academic life. And they brought a new way of doing politics to Thailand that did not at all look like the existing party politics machines that you saw sort of on both the more progressive side and the less progressive side in Thai politics prior to that. The establishment of Future Forward, it was founded in 2018, started the process of helping people, particularly young people, to imagine a new way of doing politics and a new way of participating. Almost immediately after the election, in March of 2019, when Future Forward did far better than the junta anticipated, they began looking for ways to target the party, to try to target, in particular, the leaders, Thanathon and Biabut, and to seize the party's activities and to seize the expansion of their role in shaping society. And they did this through the tried and true method of using the very politicized courts connected to the Constitutional Court in Thailand to dissolve the party on the basis of the accusation that Thanathon had been a media shareholder at the time that the party was in operation. They succeeded in doing so. So Future Forward was dissolved. A number of the party members were stripped of their positions and are banned from politics for up to 10 years. But the party reconsolidated under a new name. So they went from being Future Forward, Anakot Mai, to being Gaoklai, or the Move Forward Party. So they continue being active. But that was, even after the elections were supposed to mark a shift from dictatorship to democracy, precisely because of how the political structure was set up and the unwillingness of the military junta to let go, they've continued to constrain politics significantly.
And those constraints, that lack of options, has now fed into this mass protest movement.
Definitely. We see how the ongoing constraints from the junta era has helped set the stage for the current protest movements, precisely in the fact that the leadership is young people. The people who are 20 years old or even 15 years old in Thailand today are those who have only grown up under a series of coup governments, and for those who are a little bit older, who are in their 20s, they may remember very brief moments of more open politics in 2011 or 2012. But this is a group of people who have come of political age during a time in which they haven't been permitted to have a voice in politics. And this worked for a long time. The junta was able to use their repressive apparatus, particularly the law, to silence people for quite a long period of time. But this began to shift. People became unwilling to withstand this. And particularly in the aftermath of the death of Rama IX, this also helped create the space for people to start questioning the status quo.
You talked earlier about the very inclusive makeup of the protests, representing young people, like you just said, as well as other sections of Thai society, including elites and graduates of top universities as well, who are represented among the demonstrators. What do you think this says about how the fault lines in Thailand's politics are shifting in recent years?
So I should note that the fact that graduates of elite universities are involved is not itself surprising. In fact, if you look back even at the 1970s, students at Thammasat University and Chulalongkorn University, as well as Chiang Mai University, were all the leaders. They were all the leaders of protest movements. What is more surprising, I think, has been the very visible inclusion, and not just visible inclusion, but visible center of women and LGBTQ protesters in this round of protests. Since the 1930s and the end of the absolute monarchy, progressive movements in Thailand, of course, as in many places, have been led by men. Even though women and LGBTQ people, of course, are involved, they have never been in a visible public location in the movement. This time, it's very clear that not only are members of those groups taking key roles, but that the movements themselves have decided that it's important that they be visible and in front. This is another way in which this moment is unprecedented in Thailand. Another group of people who have been involved in a way that has been very surprising has been that over the last 2.5 weeks, particularly since the use of the water cannon against young people on the 15th. A large number of singers, actors, actresses, artists, different professional groups, including physicians who tend to be, as a group, quite conservative, have all come out publicly to condemn the use of force and to call for democracy. In the past, if members of those groups were in fact critical of military dictatorship or of any actions of the government, they would have not said anything publicly or done so very, very quietly, because they would have had a sense that if they did take a political stance, they might suffer professionally. This time, members of those groups are coming out in numbers that have never been seen before.
Another aspect of these protests that have received a lot of attention internationally is their leaderless nature, with many key figures and organizations involved in coordinating rallies. Would you say this makes the movement more difficult to contain from the authorities' perspective? It does seem like for every activist they lock up, that there are, 2 or 3 more waiting to step up.
I think you're absolutely correct. This has certainly been evident during the past 2 weeks when I would say maybe we could call them the first generation of leaders were all behind bars. In fact, only a few hours ago, 4 male prisoners who were key leaders were let out of the Bangkok remand prison. The remarkable thing is that I think that the authorities did believe that if they just arrested the 10 leaders who seemed to be at every protest, then this would disintegrate and they wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. Instead, what has happened has been that not only have other leaders emerged in Bangkok, but then two other phenomena have occurred. One has been the expansion of Hong Kong-style horizontal protests throughout Bangkok, where there have been protests called, usually an announcement will be posted on Facebook and Twitter at around 3 or 4 in the afternoon for people to meet in particular locations at 5 p.m. or sometimes later, 6 or 7. And those protests take place for several hours, often at a key intersection or near a transit station, and then are dissolved that evening. The other piece of the story is that in Thailand, as in many places, often the focus is far too much on what takes place in the capital. And this time, parallel to the protests that have taken place in Bangkok, there have been protests that have taken place across the country. I think the latest figure I saw is that there had been protests in 73 provinces, which is remarkable. So in each of those instances, those protests are being established by people who are seeing what is taking place in the rest of the country and decide to organize locally. And this actually started to happen in January. I was in Thailand in January and happened to be in Korat, which is a province about 3.5, 4 hours from Bangkok. And I was there for other reasons. I was there to watch a women's volleyball game, and that same weekend, that same Sunday, there was a run against dictatorship, which was initially a very small event organized by student activists in Bangkok, and the idea was for people to engage in a fun run against dictatorship. After the event was announced in Bangkok, student activists in almost every province around the country set up their own run against dictatorship. So before I went to the women's volleyball game, I went to visit the Run Against Dictatorship in Korat and spoke to the young students who organized. And they explained that they had never been involved in politics before, but they saw what was taking place and they wanted to organize. And so they did. And there were over 1,000 people who were there, and that took place everywhere. And that same kind of organizing is happening now, of course, facilitated by the very rapid sharing of information that can take place through social media of various kinds, And so it means that even if the authorities arrest the 10 key leaders, as they've tried to do in the past 2 weeks, it's not going to shut down the protests. In fact, it seems to have just caused them to expand even further.
Do you see this sort of leaderless structure, though, posing any difficulties for the protesters eventually negotiating with the government to try to find a way forward?
I don't think it poses a problem. I think quite resonant with Hong Kong, while this is a movement that has expanded quite dramatically and in numbers as well as geographic spread, there are still 10 to 15 figures who are seen as leaders of the movement. And I think it is with that group of figures that the government will need to negotiate. And I don't think there will be any difficulty in either the movement identifying who those figures are or those within the government imagining who they need to negotiate with. All they really have to think about is who are the figures who they've tried to arrest the largest number of times. And that's and that's the answer of who they have to negotiate with. I think there could be a problem if the government decides to follow through on the prosecution of the student and other leaders and imprisons them for many years. At this moment, I don't think they're in a position to do that. I think the backlash, if they lock up student and other activists who have been peacefully protesting, will be so significant that they will not be able to govern.
Do you keep in touch with people involved in the protest movement in Thailand?
I do, or as much as possible as I can while sitting in Madison, Wisconsin.
Can you give us a sense, based on those conversations, what the mood is like among the protesters? Is there a sense of optimism, or is there more of a feeling that things have deadlocked a little bit?
There is a sense of both optimism and also exhaustion. The last 3 weeks and then the last 5 months prior have been a constant series of protests, a constant series of people having to wonder if they may be arrested, if they may be assaulted, if they're being surveilled. On that latter, the answer is yes, they are being surveilled. There is a sense of hope, a sense of optimism for change, a sense of being steadfast, and also, of course, an accompanying feeling of exhaustion. Those who have been active, whether it's activists, journalists, the lawyers who are defending them, the scholars who are supporting them in different ways, and of course all of the people who are in the streets have now been active protesting almost every day for the last 3 weeks, whether it has been in the streets or in front of the court, or as today, in front of the prison. The 3 people who were released tonight were not released until exactly midnight. The prison held them until the very last moment of the day. But there is also a sense that no one is going to stop. I mean, and the reason why there is a sense that no one is going to stop, no one is going to turn back, is that for those who are active today, they have a profound sense of history. I didn't mention this earlier, but it is fascinating to note that this is a protest in which sometimes you will see people holding up history books written by progressive scholars in protests. So one of those is my colleague here at UW-Madison, Thongchai Winichagun. There's also books by a historian based in Thailand, Natapon Jaijing. His books are often held up. And the reason is that many of those who are actively protesting see what they are doing is trying to make the promise of the 1932 end of absolute monarchy real. So they're not going to stop, because for them, this isn't a movement that just started 3 weeks ago or 5 months ago, or even in March 2019 when the rule of the NCPO officially ended. But this is a movement that began when the People's Party, the group of civilian and military actors who fomented the transition from absolute to constitutional monarchy, first dared to do so. And it's a struggle that, then continues through the dictatorships of the 1950s, when citizens rose up against dictatorship through the 1970s, when students and people rose up in October of 1973 to end dictatorship and were then brutally murdered in October of 1976, through to May 1992, when people rose up against dictatorship, through to March, April, and May of 2010, when red-shirted protesters were in the streets and were then brutally killed. So it will be very difficult for the current government to halt this movement, because it is an attempt to redress a very long-standing series of injustices.
Tyrell, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your insights on this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tyrell Haberkorn is a professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a 2020 Guggenheim Fellow. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman with 2 L's, 1 T, and Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.